Hello, hello, and welcome. I'm Meron Khalili. We are DiEM25, a radical political movement for Europe, and this is another live discussion featuring subversive ideas you won't hear anywhere else. And tonight we're talking Elon Musk, the world's richest human. Yes, Musk is now reshaping politics in troubling ways, using his vast wealth and control over technology to influence elections and public discourse. 2 years ago, he bought X, formerly Twitter, placing himself at the center of the news via his own account, the largest on the platform. But it wasn't until last year that Musk got deeply involved in politics, jumping around on stage with Donald Trump and injecting more than $250 million into the man's campaign to help to get him elected. Musk has now, in recent weeks, been throwing grenades into Europe's political mainstream, supporting an anti-migrant, hardline nationalist party in Germany ahead of elections there, and calling for the resignation of the British Prime Minister. So all of this highlights the alarming intersection of tech and political power. So how did we get here? I mean, wealthy elites have always shaped public discourse and policy, but why does it feel now like we've broken through to a fresh level of hell? And of course, the question we always ask here on DiEM TV, how can we push back against it? To answer these questions, we've got two people that have coined the terms that we often use to describe the mess that we're in: techno-feudalism, cloud capital, and then shitification. And that's, of course, our own Yanis Varoufakis. And I'm delighted to welcome to DiEM TV for the first time Cory Doctorow, the science fiction author, activist, and journalist, and DiEM25 member. And of course, we have you out there. If you've got thoughts, comments, rants, something that you really think should be said in this debate, then put it in the YouTube chat and we'll put it to our panel. Some very quick housekeeping. If you'd like to hit the bell there on YouTube, the bell icon, you won't miss any of our new videos. Or if you prefer to hear us on a podcast, just go to your favorite podcasting app and enter the word DiEM25 and you'll find our podcast there. Let's kick it off with Cory. Cory, how did we get here?
Well, I'll tell you how I got here. My first encounter with Elon Musk. So I had a friend and colleague who was a science fiction writer named Ian Banks, who was a legendary socialist science fiction writer. And one day on Twitter, I saw a tweet from Elon Musk saying he considered himself a utopian socialist in the mold of Ian Banks. And Ian had died not that long before, and I said, like, I knew Ian, and he was an ardent trade unionist, and he would not have been happy about being identified with a man who's in trouble with the National Labor Relations Board for virulent union busting. And Musk came back and he said, well, the thing is that in Ian Banks's famous culture novels, there are no trade unions, and that's why I think I can consider myself in his mold. And I said, with all due respect, Ian Banks' culture novels are set in a future where faster than light ships that hold 1 trillion people and are piloted by galactic scale superintelligences roam the galaxy. The fact that there's no trade unions in that world tells us nothing about whether they need to be here. And he said, well, if Banks could have seen the degree of automation in a Tesla factory, he would have not expected me to unionize my factories either. And I said, again, there is a world of difference between faster than light travel and eking out marginal gains in the production of cars. And then he blocked me and called me an enemy of humanity. And he is one of these guys that, as a science fiction writer, you run into, as immortalized in that great tweet. The science fiction writer, I've written a novel about the torment nexus so that you don't create the torment nexus. Tech bro, I have created the torment nexus. As William Gibson always says, cyberpunk was a warning, not a suggestion. And whenever I think about Musk, I feel some personal responsibility, because there is a kind of cadre of tech billionaires who've read our dystopias and mistaken them for business plans. And I always come back to this great quote from A Fish Called Wanda. Aristotle was not Belgian. The principle of Buddhism is not every man for himself. The London Underground is not a political movement. These are all mistakes. I looked them up. And when I hear Elon Musk talk about his views and how they connect to world historical phenomena, to the literature he's metabolized, to the ideologies he claims to espouse, most notably free speech absolutism, something I have some connection to given my long association with speech fights on the internet through the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I think of him as being one of these people who has absorbed just enough of things that are kind of in his orbit that he can deploy them tactically to justify what is the ultimate view of Musk, which is Will Hoyt's view of conservatives, that the law, that conservatism has one tenet, that there are in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind, and out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect. And I think that is Muskism in a nutshell there.
Thank you very much for that explanation of Musk. Are there any kind of, before I hand the floor over to Yanis, any sort of, I mean, in terms of looking at the aggregation and the consolidation of power between big tech and that big tech has got to this point where we're in this situation today with Musk, can you take us, like, give us a lightning speed, like how is it, because it's shifted a lot in the last 8 years as well. So if you can give us that background just to bring us up to speed to 2025.
I mean, I think like Trump, Musk is best understood as a result and not a cause, that there's a kind of sociopathic billionaire shaped hole in the world, someone who can inveigle sweetheart government contracts, someone who is better at PR than he is at engineering, someone who is capable of abusing the law to force people who actually invented things that he subsequently bought to describe him as the inventor as part of his myth building. Musk has bought everything successful he's done, you know, from SpaceX to Tesla to Donald Trump, another thing he's recently purchased. And he nevertheless characterizes himself in the tradition of all these tech billionaires as a self-made man. When we decided that we would no longer enforce policies that prohibit predatory acquisitions, that prohibit lock-in, that give a special advantage to incumbents over new entrants, we created a kind of winner-take-all lottery where whatever mediocrity scrambled to the top of the heap, you know, stabbing people in the back on their way most quickly, could then convert that to a durable advantage. You know, the difference now between now and then is not that in the old days when tech was better, that we had better people leading it. It was that they faced more constraint. They had to worry about competitors because our policies promoting competition were not yet completely destroyed. They had to worry about regulators because they hadn't fully captured the regulatory apparatus. They had to worry about their workers leaving because tech workers were then the princes of labor, you know, people whose labor was in such short demand and whose skills were so hard to find in the market that they could just tell their bosses to F off whenever their bosses asked them to do things. And they had to contend with the, you know, wonderful nature of digital technology, which is that new technologies can always be plugged into old ones. So, you know, when Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook, he had this billionaire problem. His billionaire problem was called Rupert Murdoch, who owned another service called MySpace. Everyone who wanted social media was already on MySpace, and it was a big lift to ask people to leave all their friends behind and go to Facebook. And rather than make them ask that, he just gave them a bot. And you logged into Facebook, you gave it your MySpace login and password. The bot would go to MySpace several times a day, scrape all the messages waiting for you, come back to your Facebook account, put them in your Facebook inbox, and then you could reply to them and it would send them back to MySpace. You didn't have to worry about that. That interoperability was kind of par for the course with technology, and it gave new market entrants enormous advantage over big established incumbents. You know, the in the memorable phrase of Jeff Bezos, your margin is my opportunity. If HP is selling $10,000 a gallon ink, that's an opportunity for someone who wants to sell $100 a gallon ink, because, you know, people will jump on that offer. And what we've done in the years since is we've made IP law so expansive that it not only allows these large incumbents to ignore regulation when it comes to privacy, labor protections, consumer rights, but also to wield regulation against new market entrants and shut them down, stop them from taking advantage of that latent power of technology. And so you combine these four changes: the drawdown of competition, the capture of regulators, the deployment of regulation in the form of IP against new market entrants, and the gutting of labor power for tech workers. You know, we've seen it's now over 400,000 tech layoffs in the last 24 months in the United States alone. And you've got a place where people who are no better than they used to be and no worse can simply act on their worst nature without facing any constraint or consequence, so that you unleash the id of someone like Elon Musk, someone who has no principles except for these kind of weird Muskist kind of every man for himself and me first principles, without any constraint and with unlimited access to a capital market fattened on quantitative easing and huge bailouts, and you get what we have now. You get this weird, manifestly unfit, paranoid, ultimately very stupid man who's become extremely important to our politics.
Thank you, Corey. Yanis, you've heard Corey's diagnosis. What's your take?
It's so good to be hearing and listening to Corey, because so far, for a while now, we've been reading each other's books, we have been endorsing each other, promoting each other's books. It's very good to actually be, even if it's only in 2 dimensions, through the medium of Cloud Capital. It's great, Corey, to be on the same, timeline and, not just exchanging text messages. Look, the only reason why we're talking about Elon Musk and not Jeff Bezos or Zuckerberg presently is because he has become the de facto vice president of the United States. He purchased a very cushy position in the administration. It was an amazing and astonishing investment. For a couple of $100 million, he's made a couple of $100 billions, actually more. I don't think there is a better return to one's dollar than what he has already achieved. Okay, so this is why we're talking about him. I personally don't care at all if he writes an op-ed in Die Welt about his support of the AfD. I believe in free speech. If he wants to support the poor excuses for human nature in the German elections, let him do it. I don't think this is what is worrying. It's not just him, of course. There is a gentleman that you all know, Peter Thiel, that he has also ingratiated himself. These people who have joined the Trump campaign relatively early on. Peter Thiel supplied the actual vice president, right? It was a former employee of Peter Thiel. All these things are perfectly legitimate reasons to feel sick in the stomach. When you have men, the oligarchy of tremendous wealth with a very sordid history. Don't forget the way that they've been treating the mothers of their children, trying to impoverish them through the courts, the way they've been endorsing books that are justifying torture and laugh at the notion of human rights. The zillions that they are making from government and military, in particular procurement, the manner in which they are targeting any government program which doesn't enrich them, but it does something little in order to assist the poor. This is all nauseating stuff. More recently, we saw Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, visiting Miami and having a little tete-a-tete with Elon Musk. And I can tell you that one of the reasons why Elon Musk is so enamored of her and doesn't want her to be deposed, unlike Nigel Farage, that for some reason suddenly he's in his bad books. He wants, instead of giving him £100 million, he wants to depose him from the leadership of the Reform UK party. Well, the reason is that Meloni has effectively offered him the opportunity of having the Italian state move away from IRIS2, the satellite network that the European Union was planning to create in competition with Starlink. And that, that is a reason to be extremely worried when you have such deals being concocted in Mar-a-Lago between the Italian neo-fascist prime minister and Elon Musk. I don't need to add any adjectives to him. But having said all that, and let me just add one more thing. He's not a free speech absolutist. He's an absolutist. He's a totalitarian but I don't think he cares about free speech unless it is his own free speech. He supposedly he's supporting Tommy Robinson's free speech, and the fact that Tommy Robinson is in prison for contempt of court, for actually lying about a refugee, a Syrian refugee, in court and outside of court. But when Julian Assange was rotting in the Belmarsh high security prison, Elon Musk said not one word, because for him, a man who is convicted of nothing should rot in prison if he does against the interests of the CIA, of the NSA, of the Pentagon, and of Elon Musk. So give it a rest, Elon. You don't give a damn about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, especially for the free press. But the point of now I'm going to play, to some extent, devil's advocate in actually arguing that there isn't. We need to ask ourselves what is really new about this, because many people are pretending that what is happening with Musk, with Thiel, and with the other members of the brotherhood of the oligarchy, that this is something really new. Well, is it? Is it really new? I mean, yes, but not for the reasons that most journalists of the liberal establishment press tell us. John D. Rockefeller, he headed a dynasty that makes Musk look an amateur. Henry Ford, he bought newspapers and canvassed and effectively forced municipalities to rip out tramways and to replace them with Ford automobiles and buses. Thomas Edison electrocuted famously an elephant at Coney Island just to demonstrate that Westinghouse's direct current electricity was dangerous, whereas alternating current was dangerous, whereas Edison's direct current wasn't. Big business has always enjoyed a revolving door kind of relationship with government. Remember that Bill Clinton appointed Rubin, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, to the Treasury as his Treasury finance minister, in order effectively to remove all and every shackle that was since the 1930s holding back Goldman Sachs from doing effectively committing the crimes that they committed immediately after the Clinton administration allowed them to do this. And then Obama brings the same person back in order to bail out the same banks after the 2008 collapse that these bankers had created. So we have to keep all this in mind. But here's how I'm going to complete this long thought. There is one thing which is new, and that is the new form of capital that these people actually possess. Cory knows that I call it cloud capital. It's not a produced means of production, it's a produced means of behavioral modification. And that gives them, it's effectively a new hyper weapon, which these broligarchs, these cloudalists as I call them, or techno-feudal barons or lords, they possess, which, a Henry Ford, a Thomas Edison, a Westinghouse, a Rockefeller didn't. And unless we understand the manner in which this new form of capital, which I call cloud capital, operates, and the way that it usurps markets, it replaces them, it replaces profit with rent, it effectively turns capital, cloud capital, into a gigantic parasite, which is 100 times, 1,000,000 times bigger than the organism on which it is parasitic. The organism is traditional capitalism, and of course the labor force, and of course the surplus value that these workers produce. We need to understand that, because this new hyper weapon of the lords of big tech, of the Musks of the world, not just Musk, Gates, Google, don't forget them, right? Even though they are Democrats, they've always been in this game, and they're already in the inner circle of Trump, or they will be very soon. It is important to home in on the political economy of the phenomenon of which Musk is simply an epiphenomenon.
Thank you, Yanis. Before I hand the floor back to you, Cory, a couple of questions and comments from the chat. Subradeep says, Musk is the face of right-wing extremism. His extension of support for British anti-immigrant parties is a clear sign. Kirk Doherty says an open market system should be open to everybody without regulations to stop these rich boys from monopolizing markets. When I was a kid, monopolies were broken up. Now they're not. Sando says Musk bought Twitter specifically to be able to use his power to control the narrative. He's a real life Bond villain. And Anonymous Friend notes that it's a menace to US national security, to the US national security state, to allow someone to get this wealthy. Corey, hand it back to you. Your take on Dennis.
Yeah, I think that it's important to understand what Musk is actually doing. So Giannis used the phrase behavior modification, and there's different ways of people deploying that phrase when they describe how tech works. I think some of them are quite useful. Like, you know, if you're a tech guy and you understand that people have certain activities that are non-discretionary, like being enmeshed in a community or dealing with government services or your employer, or if your kid is going to school and they have to use certain services, then how you use the technology does indeed modify people's behavior, right? You do, in fact, force people to conduct their affairs in certain ways. And I think that is what we talk about when we talk about the risks of monopoly. Historically, the case against monopoly, which, you know, has been around for a very long time. People have argued about this for a very long time. Historically, the case for that has been that if the state does not regulate firms to prevent them from getting too big, then the firms themselves become regulators. They get to decide who enters the market. They get to decide how people conduct their lives and so on. You know, if the only way you're going to get broadband out in the countryside is with Elon Musk, because Musk has convinced governments not to pull fiber out to low density communities, which is a thing that he's, you know, currently embarked upon. It's an echo of something he did previously, which was to have this kind of fake high-speed train between San Francisco and LA that he promised but never built. After building this ridiculous demonstration, which is a tiny tunnel in Las Vegas that goes from a hotel to a convention center. And he said, soon we'll build a version of this that's much larger and it'll be evacuated, so it'll be frictionless, and we'll send Teslas through it so fast that no one will ever need a train. And so then you starve the state of investment in public transit, and you get to sell cars in the same way where we're seeing a drawdown of investment in fiber in places where Starlink is very successful. Notably in Ontario, where I'm from in Canada, there's been a lot of this, and this is coming as a result of Musk wanting to control our behavior, right? If he's the only game in town when you want to get on the internet, and we all have to get on the internet, that's where our bank is and our family is and our job is and our kids' school is and how we interact with politics and civics and so on, then you have to do it through Musk. And so if Musk makes choices about which services are available or which ones are prioritized and which ones are downranked, or how the service is billed and whether upload is billed at a higher rate than download so you can consume but not participate, that's structuring private behavior. It's a very powerful form of behavior modification. But there's another form of behavior modification that tech bros like to claim, and it goes back to this kind of science fictional conceit, which is that tech bros take this warmed over Skinnerian behavior modification psychology, and they declare that they can combine it with big data and automated processes. These days, they just say with AI, and that they can use that to bypass your critical faculties to make you do whatever you want, whatever they want. And this is a very self-serving claim, especially if you're selling ads, right? If your pitch to the advertisers is the reason you should pay a 40% premium to advertise on my service is that I built a functional mind control ray using big data, then that's a very great pitch. But, you know, everyone who's ever claimed to have built a mind control ray was lying to themselves or everyone else. It was true of Rasputin. It was true of Mesmer. It was true of the CIA with MK Ultra. It's true of pickup artists and people who believe in neurolinguistic programming. It's all junk. Whatever behavior mod you get out of a new kind of trick quickly regresses to the mean. You know, the era in which 99 cents does not automatically equal $1 is long behind us, but there was a time when you could sell someone something for 99 cents and they didn't realize that you were selling them something for $1. And so these tricks regress to the mean very quickly. And yet you have these claims that are quite extraordinary being made by tech bros and sometimes being echoed by their own critics. This is a thing the scholar at Virginia Tech, Lee Vinsel, calls crita-hype, where you repeat the hype claims. So we saw a lot of this with Musk and his claims about automation. Musk knows that his audience of business leaders is insatiably horny for firing workers and replacing them with machines who don't talk back. And that's why Musk has put so much energy into pretending to have built a robot. 3 years ago, he put a guy in a robot costume on stage and had that robot dance around on stage and declared it to be a robot. Last year, he put a remote controlled robot on stage that was being controlled by workers in an off-site location, and lied and said that it was an autonomous robot bartender that would soon make every bartender obsolete. And you know, these claims can be repeated in critical ways that are useful and in critical ways that are useless. So we can say, or harmful. So we can say usefully, it's quite shameful that Musk and his audience of business leaders hate workers and don't want to pay them and would like to discipline them with automation and suppress their wages. And we can say that it's ridiculous that they put on these absurd demos where they're just using this kind of Potemkin technology. And those are good and useful criticisms because they strike at the root of how Musk is raising money and converting money to power. But then there's a harmful criticism, a criticism that's self-defeating, which is to say Musk has got a mind control rate because he owns Twitter, or Musk is going to make labor obsolete because he's got functional robots, or Musk is going to put all the taxi drivers out of business because he's invented a full self-driving car. Musk has promised a full self-driving car within 12 months every year since 2014, like clockwork. He does not have a full self-driving car. He is not likely to have a full self-driving car anytime soon. And if we point out that he's lying in order to suck in naive investors and to feed a hype cycle that is hostile to workers and human thriving, we do good work in countering Musk's power. But if we repeat his self-serving lies as criticism, right? If we say Musk is a sorcerer who's got autonomous robots, a super intelligent AI, a self-driving car, all of the things that he claims that he's got, which he manifestly doesn't have. We help him sell stock in his enterprises. We help him land more cushy no-bid government contracts. We help him hold back the public transit investment, broadband investment, all of these other things. You know, a good example of this would actually just be understanding the limitations of Starlink. So Starlink, you know, it is a revolutionary technology in many ways, and there's certainly applications for it. No one's ever going to put a fiber optic cable on a ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And that's a place where having a satellite constellation would be very useful. But the idea that Starlink can ever compete with hardline internet, let alone fiber, is absurd. We're talking about a technology whose maximum speed, if you are the sole user of it, is 1/1,000,000th of the maximum speed of a single strand of fiber. But unlike fiber, you can't add to that speed. You can put lots of strands of fiber in the same conduit. And unlike fiber, every time someone joins your Starlink cluster, or one of your neighbors gets on Starlink, your speed drops in half. And the idea that we can just somehow solve this by innovating is like the idea that we can somehow solve the traffic problem by innovating with self-driving cars. You know, geometry hates cars. There is no number of self-driving cars you can add that will reduce traffic, in the same way that there's no number of spectrum sharing satellite transceivers that can reduce the congestion on the only electromagnetic spectrum in the universe that we have accessible to us. And so it's really important to like focus on the material reality of what he's delivering and to contrast that with what he's claiming to deliver, and to focus our criticism on the things that make him poorer and weaker, and not the things that help him sell more nonsense.
Thank you, Corey. And Yanis, as I hand it over to you, just to tee it up on the same topic, Sasha from the chat says, I get that AI and digital cloud technologies are scary, but do we actually believe it's something entirely new and that much more effective at modifying behavior than TV and traditional media used to be? Yanis.
Yes, absolutely. But first, let me also say that, you see, Musk has succeeded in making us talk about him and not talk about Jeff Bezos, who is a far more scary figure for me, and a greater menace to the world. And not just him, right? But Thiel, Google, and so on. Zuckerberg, what happened? Have we forgotten about Zuckerberg and Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and all that? And Instagram. So he succeeded. And one of the reasons why he bought Twitter was because he didn't have that much cloud capital. His enterprises were cutting edge, SpaceX and Tesla and so on, but they were very old fashioned. They were producing all type of terrestrial capital, even if some of it went up in space. Let me now answer our viewers' point, which I think goes to the heart of it. And it also connects with another question that we had in the chat on YouTube. Is it any different to a monopoly? Is this different to standard monopoly capitalism? Why can't we regulate big tech in the way that Teddy Roosevelt regulated and broke up Standard Oil and Rockefeller's enterprises? There is a difference. And the difference is that from where I'm standing, take Amazon, for instance. It's not a monopoly, folks. It's not even a marketplace. It is a trading platform on which you will find, hundreds of thousands at every moment in time of buyers and sellers. But it is not a market, because a market requires a degree of decentralization, even a monopoly. Imagine you go into a shopping mall, which is owned by one person, and that person owns all the shops, controls everything that is there, the advertising, everything. At least you and I, you, Corey, me, Meron, we can walk around together and we can actually talk about it. We can even organize a little consumer boycott between the three of us, saying we're not going to buy from that bastard who owns the shopping mall, right? But when you're in Amazon, you can't talk to one another. Every communication, every sale, every offer, every post is regulated by a centrally planned algorithm that belongs to Jeff Bezos. So essentially, this is not a market. It's a trading place which is controlled, which, as I've written before, and Corey knows that I like to make this point, it is the wet dream of the Soviet planners, of Gosplan, of the Ministry of Economic Planning. Because what was the Ministry of Economic Planning, Gosplan, trying to do under the Soviet Union, especially after 1936? They were trying to replace the market, especially after they got rid of the new economic policy of Lenin and so on. They wanted to replace the market with a bureaucratic system, a cybernetic kind of algorithmic process by which to match individual consumers with individual producers, or with factories, or with farmers, and saying to the factory that made shoes, we want so many shoes, color black, these sizes, at these prices, and then match these shoes with the demand from the consumers, to replace the market. Now, this is exactly what the algorithm of Amazon does. The difference is that under the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, at least there was some pretense that this was done for the purposes of maximizing social welfare. Whereas in the case of Amazon, it's not even a secret. The algorithm is optimized for one purpose: to maximize the likelihood that Jeff Bezos will extract the maximum rent from each transaction and the maximum amount of free labor from each one of us who posts and reviews and does stuff on Amazon.com. Right? So this is not a monopoly. I call it a cloud fiefdom. You can call it a digital fiefdom, or a digital platform which is feudal in nature, because this guy doesn't produce anything of the stuff that you buy on Amazon. He simply charges a rent for every economic activity that's happening on that. I call it a cloud rent in order to distinguish it from a ground rent. Because a cloud rent, unlike in feudalism, requires, in order to materialize, it requires a lot of capital, but it's a cloud capital form. It is of the algorithm type which modifies what we do. It doesn't. Corey is right. They will never succeed. Thankfully, they will never succeed in brainwashing us, in making me want to buy, a coffee machine if I don't like coffee. They will never be able to do that. But they can modify my behavior regarding my priorities. If I want to buy electric bicycle, I may buy it much, much earlier than I would have, and I will buy it from a vendor that the algorithm chooses for me for the purpose of maximizing the cloud rent of Jeff Bezos. Now, that is a unique power and one that you cannot regulate in a way that the Teddy Roosevelt administration utilized in order to regulate. So we need something very, very different here, unless we find ways of socializing the algorithm and changing property rights of the algorithm. I don't believe we can do very much in the standard New Deal social democratic European manner.
Thank you, Yanis. And there's lots of people on the chat who are clamoring for solutions to some of the problems that we're talking about. We will get to that in a minute. But before I do, since we talk politics, and this is a political topic, Yanis, while you still have the floor, I would just like to focus a little on Musk's recent interventions in European politics. And if you can draw for us, what is it about is European politics uniquely vulnerable to this kind of influence? Is there something new that's happening here or not? Is this just the same old billionaires influencing politics as always?
Well, we need to separate Musk's reasons for doing what he's doing, which I don't understand. I have to admit. I think that the guy is probably on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I think that he may need some therapy for his own purposes. If you remember the great movie Citizen Kane, when Kane starts losing it, and he wants to be not only the great distributor of news, but he also wants to be president. He wants to be senator, whatever it is, and he wants to. The only thing he didn't want to become at some point was archbishop, or the pope. So there is paranoia. So, but I don't care what. I'm not in the business of minding Musk's soul. But the point you are raising, Meron, is central. It's the reason why DiEM25 exists, because Europe is bunk. We created DiEM25 because in 2015, 2016, it became absolutely obvious, evident, self-evident, that it is a faulty political and economic design, especially after we created the common currency. We have effectively created the circumstances that will maximize the magnitude and depth of economic crisis, of social crisis, of political crisis, while at the same time removing all the shock absorbers, the social programs and the social support programs that would ameliorate these crises. So and the result is, we were saying, remember, back in 2015, 2016, that Europe will either democratize or by 2025, and thus the 25 in DiEM25, this whole thing called the European Union is going to start disintegrating with immense political, social, ethical, of course, technological costs. And this is what is happening. So, in Europe now, there's no government in Germany, there's no government in France. The Austrian government has just not even convened. Holland has a government which they can't be proud of, with the Geert Wilders party effectively having the prime ministership. Italy is in the hands of a neo-fascist. The greatest hope of the liberal establishment, Emmanuel Macron, is effectively a lame duck facing an early retirement. And the most interesting thing is that the greatest, if you want, organizational mind in Europe from the establishment point of view, Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank and former Italian Prime Minister, who came out with a proposal, which is interesting. I mean, at least it's a sensible, rational, bourgeois, liberal proposal for what needs to be done in Europe, that he was paid millions in order to produce by European taxpayers. He tabled that proposal a few months ago, and it's already in the dustbin. It's already been confined to the dustbin of history by the leaders of Europe. So that I think explains why any Musk around the world any sort of deranged ultra-rightist with a smidgen of power can poke fun at the Europeans and can, I mean, it is absurd that it is an issue that Musk wrote an op-ed in Die Welt. Who cares? And the only reason why we care is because we feel so insecure as a result of having allowed the European Union effectively to become non-viable and a clear and present danger for humanity, not just for Europeans. But we are the stupid continent that is going to play a very significant role in destabilizing the globe.
Thank you, Yanis. Corey, your take on that, please.
So I'm slightly more optimistic about Europe, maybe because I'm the regretful holder of a British passport, and so I keenly feel the loss of my Europeanness, and have done for many years. I'll tell you, I think that if we want to think about kind of the underlying motivations, the political economy of how and why people fight monopolies, and then the nuts and bolts of how monopolies get fought, and look at the historic examples and some contemporary examples, there are some important differences, Yanis, as you say, between the trust-busting fights of the Gilded Age and the early part of the 20th century, going after Rockefeller and so on. And some of them cut against using the tools that we had before, right? And I think you've enumerated them well. But some of those differences actually cut in favor of doing monopoly enforcement in today's world. So one would be the globalized nature of tech platforms. This is, weirdly enough, a kind of advantage, or can be turned to advantage by regulators. And an example of that pretty recently is that the United Kingdom chartered in, I believe, 2019, the largest technical unit of any competition regulator in the world, something called the Digital Markets Unit at the Competition and Markets Authority. They hired 70 engineers on full-time government salaries to do really deep, in-depth investigations of the monopolization tactics of large tech firms. This is an order of magnitude more technologists per capita than any other competition regulator in the world. And there was meant to be secondary legislation to give them enforcement powers that they could use in combination with all this technical expertise. And that secondary legislation just died on the order paper year after year until late last year, not because of any particular animus, and I'll get to that in a second, among regulators against antitrust, but just because the US has been in such, or the UK has been in such a shambles, right? They just have government after government, proroguing after proroguing, no confidence votes and so on. And so they just couldn't pass legislation that was ultimately uncontroversial, because I believe the Digital Markets Unit's enforcement powers were, if not unanimous, at least broadly bipartisan within the British Parliament when they were finally given. So you have this giant unit with lots of engineers doing these really deep dives into the scam of tech. So they did this big report on ad tech. They did another report on platform economies. They did another report on mobile economies and mobile devices, which they couldn't do anything with. 400 pages of exquisitely researched market studies, compelled from firms using investigatory powers that could force firms to explain how they worked on penalty of perjury. Nothing they could do with them. But across the channel, you have the European Commission, which has enormous enforcement powers and almost no engineers. And so they were able to pick up these reports and use them both as the basis for some very successful enforcement actions, taking, I believe it was billions out of Apple for the mobile payments abuse, but also as the basis for the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. And it didn't end there. So it turns out that the same scam that Apple and Google and Facebook and Twitter and all these other companies, the same scams they pull in the United Kingdom, they're not just identical in the European Union, they're identical in every country in the world. And so Japan and South Korea translated the European case against Apple that had been so successful and brought it in Japan and South Korea, and won more judgments against Apple in both of those territories. There is no reason that countries in the global south, whose economies have been raided by these big tech platforms, couldn't pick up the ball and do this again. I mean, Nigeria has a lot of tech experience. They could very easily bring us a similar kind of case using the exhibits and the arguments that have already won in all these other courts. And they could not only take hundreds of millions of dollars back out of Apple, Google, and Facebook that these companies looted from their economies, they could also open the space for an indigenous tech sector by coming down on these firms. So this is an area of hope. This is not a thing you could have done against Rockefeller. I mean, Rockefeller had an empire that spanned the globe. He had a huge German operation, but the German operation was sui generis. It was not what he was not doing in Germany what he did in America. It's true that once they weakened his empire in America, they reduced his power to resist German enforcers, but they could not just copy and paste an American case against Rockefeller. In terms of the other advantage that Europe has, and I think lawmakers have more broadly around the world, especially outside of the United States, it's that the people who live in those countries don't view these tech companies as domestic success stories. They see them as foreign exploitative entities. There is great political will for taking down American tech giants in Europe, in Canada, in South Korea and Japan and so on. I mean, once you've had your own tech sector destroyed, both by the forces of history and by the predatory conduct of these firms, there's no reason not to tackle them. If Marguerite Vestager was going after a still vibrant European tech sector, if she was attacking Nokia, Ericsson, Deutsche Telekom, and Olivetti, she would have real trouble in the European Parliament. But no matter how many times Nick Clegg kind of slimed his way into Brussels and said, Facebook is here to defend European cyberspace from Chinese communism, nobody believed him, right? They understood that his $4 million a year was being paid to him so that he could open European markets to an American firm. And so there is great political will for doing this. And unlike other things that there might be political will for, like turning away refugees or eroding the welfare state or what have you, these things actually improve your economy, right? On the one hand, there's like the cash that you just extract from these firms. And that's the reason that so many American red state conservative attorneys general have gone after companies like Google and Facebook and so on. It's because if your path to electoral victory in, say, Texas is to promise never to have taxes, but at the same time, Texans expect to have roads, you need to find some money from somewhere. And so rather than taxing billionaires, you can attack woke big tech companies on the coasts and hit them for hundreds of millions of dollars. This is true in Europe. It's true in the global south. It's true anywhere you want to extract money from them. But it's also good because it incubates a domestic tech sector, right? There's nothing about tech that is uniquely American. And indeed, the fact that Americans are setting tech policy for the world is bad for the world. There are unique local reasons to regulate tech in certain ways, to build tech in certain ways. The idea that like the thing that works for Bros in Menlo Park is ideally adapted for people everywhere else is not just like theoretically false, but provably false. Like in West Africa, the widest used messaging tool is not WhatsApp. It's a thing called GB WhatsApp, which is an illegal interoperable WhatsApp alternative interface that was developed by open source hackers on the battlefields of Syria to adapt WhatsApp to their own uses. And then it's spread around the globe and has become like the West African go-to version of WhatsApp, because there's just like locally appropriate ways to design a messaging protocol that are not uppermost in the minds of Bros in Menlo Park when they're designing it. So this is good policy. It's policy that is like popular, that the public likes, that puts money into the public coffers, that is relatively straightforward to enforce compared to the historic contours of antitrust when we had to build a case against giant firms in every country. Now we can build the case collaboratively across multiple countries. And, they deserve it, right? It makes the world a better place. So I have some optimism here for Europeans, not because I think European lawmakers are good or virtuous or competent, but because I think that the circumstances are right for venal, flawed, incompetent regulators to do lots of good things.
Thank you, Corey. Yanis, if we were all lobbying the EU in the way that Corey proposed, do you think they're likely to go through?
We'll never lobby the EU ever again. I think it's a lost cause. you know, I have a very sorry and long experience of that. I think they are lost cause. To plug your book, Corey.
Oh, yeah.
Lost Cause, a great sci-fi.
Yeah.
You should read it, folks.
I have a copy of that around
With-
here somewhere.
There you are. Along with what was it, Radicalized, which was a very prescient novel regarding
Yeah.
the killing of what's his name, the health
That,
private insurance executive. Anyway, look,
yeah, the
this was
sociopath.
just plugging a couple of books by Corey
Well,
very
thank
quickly.
you.
Brilliant books, Corey. Well done.
Thank
Because, you know, Corey is not just a political economist and theorist of the internet and shittification and all that, but, you know, he's a great novelist as well. And he keeps writing,
That's
churning
really
them
kind
out.
of you. Thank you,
Keep
Jonas.
churning them out. I've only produced one, and I don't think I will
Well,
produce them.
that-
But anyway,
This one comes out on February 15th.
bye, folks.
And yeah, this is the third Martin Hench book, and there's a Kickstarter to pre-order it right now. It's from Macmillan, but these Kickstarters are really helpful. I launched it about an hour ago, maybe 2 hours now, and it is, where is it sitting at? I think about $30,000. So it's doing quite well. I can
Excellent.
paste the URL into the chat here.
And we'll put it on our
$32,000.
site. But let me now slightly disagree with you about Europe in particular. Before disagreeing, I will agree that we need to be very hopeful on the prospects of what I call techno rebellions, of using technologies in the ways that you have already outlined in order to counter the exorbitant power of what I call cloud capital. There's no doubt about that. And it's already happening in Africa, it's already happening in various places in the United States, but it's only the very beginning. We cannot be triumphalists about that because it's only tiny little chinks in the armor of big tech. On the question of Europe, you will allow me to say that yes, I see your point that Brussels should go all out against Silicon Valley, because we didn't do in Europe what the Chinese did. The Chinese erected a huge Chinese wall and they created their own. We don't have our own. We have zero European cloud capital. Even the cloud capital that emerges in Europe very quickly becomes Americanized, like Vault, for instance. It is gobbled up by Silicon Valley. So they could. They have the knowledge, they have the bureaucracy, the bureaucrats, they have the lawyers, they have the legal power to make a serious dent in the armor of Silicon Valley, but they don't do it. I was just looking at the numbers. Amazon made 55 billion euros revenues last year in 2024 across the European Union. It paid zero tax, precisely zero tax, through the Dutch double the sandwich with Ireland and Caribbean islands and so on. So they could have put an end to that. There's no doubt that some of the people in Brussels wanted to put an end to that. Margrethe Vestager, whom you mentioned before, tried to put an end to that. She lost every single case in the European courts. Every single case she has lost. And the money that has been extracted from Apple, the 16 billion, which the Irish government did not want to take, they were forced to take, has already been set aside. I don't know whether you know that, not in order to build housing for the homeless in Ireland, and Ireland is a very rich country these days because of big tech, because of the tax breaks and so on. But it has a very serious social crisis, social care crisis, housing crisis, and so on. Instead of using that money that they were forced to take by the European Union, they are setting it aside in order to create electricity generation capacities for the big tech, on behalf of big tech. So that is a absolute catastrophe in Europe, but more broadly, Corey, allow me to say that if you don't own your own cloud capital, you're doomed. Your powers to enforce and to regulate will wane. And don't forget that, yes, there is this is what we are trying to do as DiEM25. We're trying to harvest the anger, the rage of Europeans against this kind of peasantry in which they have been reduced to by Silicon Valley. We try to utilize it in order to we try to give it creative ways of expressing itself through policy, through serious thinking, not through just blatant anger. But at the very same time, there is a very large, silent, idiotic majority out there in Europe, let's be honest about that, who don't give a damn. For whom it is, for whom Google is like the air they breathe. And if you say anything to them about regulating Google, they say they will go and fight on Google's side. We must not forget. Interoperability. You mentioned interoperability a number of times, and of course you've done a lot of great work on that. And you told me that it was before I went to China a few months ago, and I checked that you were right, that the Chinese are imposing interoperability. The Europeans could impose interoperability, and they're not doing it, and they will never do it. Because you know what? Well, there is no way they would do it. Zero probability. I mean, these people, the ones representing the balance of power in the European Parliament today, because they are utterly in the pocket of Wall Street on the one hand, and Silicon Valley on the other. They simply do not have the capacity. Let me put it this way. One of the great powers of cloud capital is that it can poison the conversation. And this is something that Elon Musk tries to do single-handedly, going back to our original theme today of that particular gentleman, right? And once you poison the conversation, you can't really create a political discourse which is necessary to underpin the legislative work that is necessary in order to introduce interoperability. And, I'm becoming, even though I am libertarian to my bone, as a libertarian Marxist, to confuse people, to my bone, without creating a protective shield within which to grow your own publicly owned cloud capital, unless you can do that, and therefore create an alternative Facebook, an alternative X, an alternative Uber for that matter, that is owned by the municipality and combines Airbnb and Uber, but in a way that the algorithm is primed in favor of the well-being of the people who live there, not in favor of the owners, the private equity that owns Uber or Airbnb. Unless you do that, your powers to regulate will wane or will never be used.
Thank you, Yanis. And as I hand it back to you, Corey, if I may.
Yeah. I agree that developing a domestic capacity is critical. I want to say that the European Union is already doing some interop mandates, right? The Digital Markets Act has got this end-to-end encrypted messaging mandate. It's not where I would have started with the DMA, but the DMA is like, there's enforcement action underway. There are firms that have, made their representations about how they're going to comply with the rule. The rule is enforced. I mean, we'll see how much they thumb their nose at the rule in their final implementations and whether they face any retribution for doing so. I agree that Ireland is a basket case, and I think that it illustrates one of the real problems with federalism broadly. Having grown up in Canada and then now living in the United States and having lived in Europe for some years, federalism works well but fails badly. The problem of federalism is that small states don't want to be in the federation unless they have a relative degree of autonomy, but then they don't have the power to resist outside actors who want them to sell golden passports or create crime havens in the way that Ireland has, where you just draw down corporate enforcement. Because it's not just tech enforcement that is light in Ireland, right? As you point out, it's tax enforcement is the start of it, but they're also lax on privacy, they're lax on labor rights, they're lax on all the things where the jurisdiction for enforcement starts there. The DMA and the DSA are quite interesting in that they both bypass the Irish court. So the first port of call for enforcing DMA and DSA violations is the European Court of Justice, which is a wildly imperfect entity, but it's not the Irish Data Commissioner, right? The Irish Data Commissioner, to a first approximation, doesn't get out of bed. And when they do, they spend most of the day in their pajamas eating breakfast cereal and watching cartoons, right? Ireland is the place where privacy cases go to die. That's not true of the ECJ. The ECJ's got lots of problems, but it's not that problem. And, when big privacy cases go before the ECJ takes big bites out of big tech firms. And so I think that I think there's some reason, there's an ember there that we should be trying to fan into a coal. It doesn't, I don't mean that to say that it's, that we've solved the problem. I mean to say that we have something going on that is quite interesting. And the other thing that's interesting about it is that it's not being driven by the lawmakers themselves, right? There is no lobby for antitrust. There's no one who's got billions of dollars who's spending money to inveigle the world's governments into breaking up corporations or limiting their corporate power. This is like an indigenous phenomenon that is arising spontaneously out of lawmakers and their constituents because of where we are. There is this law in finance: anything that can't go on forever eventually stops. Stein's law. There are phenomena that are underway in the world that are long-run phenomena that date back to neoliberalism and Reagan and Kohl and Thatcher that have run out of runway. And I take your point from techno-feudalism. I think actually the most sharp and important point in techno-feudalism, which is that Marxists can be right that capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction, but that the thing that succeeds capitalism might be feudalism. I think that's an extremely important point that I think has been lost on a lot of leftists as they've been awaiting capitalism's implosion, is that it might leave behind something even worse. I congratulate you for it. There's lots to love about that book, but that part is something I return to over and over again. But we are at this kind of end stage of a certain kind of economic arrangement, as can be witnessed by the spontaneous eruption among lawmakers and their constituents of policies unprecedented in 2 generations that are squarely aimed at tackling corporate power, even as there are other policies that are squarely aimed at increasing it. I don't want to pretend that what we've seen is a fully erect primate striding the land. What we have is a lungfish, right? We have seen the evolution from a kind of slime creature living in the water into something that can hesitantly walk on the land sometimes. And what it turns into next is, I would like to think, up for grabs. It's the thing that I find most hopeful, in the sense that I think it's this movement against corporate power, which cuts across certain political boundaries, which cuts across certain geographic boundaries, and cuts across certain ideological boundaries in ways that we haven't seen in a long time. I mean, I think the last time I spent as much time as I do now with people who identify as right-wingers was during the Solidarność campaign, where I would show up at protests in favor of Polish trade unionists and be marching alongside hardcore Reaganite Republicans who supported Lech Walesa and Solidarność because they were anti-Soviet and not because they were pro-worker, right? We're at this very strange juncture, and it is a thing that we should be seizing a hold of, and that we should be doing as much as we can without mistaking it for the thing that will that is the final stage of the tool that we're going to need to dismantle capitalism. In terms of developing that domestic capacity, domestic cloud infrastructure, and so on, I think that the beauty of interop is that it produces a kind of intermediate stage between being stuck on Amazon's cloud and being able to have your own cloud, or to play Amazon's cloud off against a more distributed architecture or whatever, in the sense that if you can, on the one hand, withdraw Amazon's right to sue you for reverse engineering and hacking its services to set people free, and on the other hand, produce policies that nominally at least force Amazon to do some interoperability, that between those two things, you can do stuff like say, okay, well, we're not going to dismantle Amazon's cloud today, right? We don't have those data centers. We don't have that infrastructure. We don't have that code written. But what we are going to do is we're going to use a combination of law and policy to make it a one-click venture to move from Amazon's cloud to Google's cloud to Microsoft's cloud. That's not great. It's far from ideal. But all of those firms will behave better if they're worried about losing their customers' business. And as they behave better, they will be weaker in terms of their cutthroat capacity to influence law and policy, which will open space for better law and policy, for more labor organizing, for all these other things. It's a way to slide from one state to another. And it doesn't require that we have a complete program that takes us in a step change from us all being cloud serfs to us having a cooperative cloud infrastructure tomorrow.
On that note, though, Corey, if I can ask you, and also many people on the chat are asking for something that goes in this direction. We are going a little bit over time. I hope that's okay. Is there anything in terms of actionable solutions that we could leave people with? What is the thing that really scares the shit out of these tech companies that doesn't depend on higher powers stepping in and taking their toys away or making life difficult for them? What would you get people to do after watching this? Are there campaigns that are interesting? Are there specific weak spots that can be targeted? Are there organizations that are worth supporting that go in the direction of reining in the unbridled power of big tech?
I don't think there's much individuals can do, I'm sorry to say. I think that these are policy problems, they're macroeconomic problems. Forming tech unions, supporting tech unions as part of a revitalized labor market, that's all very important. It's something every worker and everyone who thinks about a better future should be involved with. In terms of the one weird trick, like if I could wave a wand and make Margaret Vestager create a new policy, I would create service level net neutrality. So we have net neutrality at the carrier level, like your ISP has to give you the bits that you ask for. You click on a link and your ISP is obliged legally to grab whatever data is on the other end of that link and give it to you as fast as it can. And this is in contrast with the idea that your carrier might slow down certain services and prioritize others and charge people money for access to you. Say, somewhere in Brussels, there's a guy who wants to watch Netflix. We're going to make YouTube faster than Netflix unless Netflix outbids YouTube for premium carriage. That's obviously a thing that gives an enormous amount of market structuring power to these infrastructure companies, these internet companies. I think we need this at the service layer. I think we should have a rule that says that every intermediary, as a matter of law, should be required to deliver the things that you ask for as efficiently and as quickly as possible. And so by that, I mean, if there's a thing in Google search index that is the most responsive to your query, they should be legally obliged to deliver it. If there's a person who's subscribed to a feed of yours on a social media platform, then when you post, that person should see it. And if you subscribe to someone, then when they post, you should see it. I think that if you send an email to someone and it goes into spam and they drag it out of spam, that the service should be obliged to never put it back into spam without having to be charged for premium carriage or a special arrangement or verification or what have you. And this is a very, sounds like a very crude idea, very simple idea. What it does is it eliminates almost all of the rent-seeking opportunities that the platforms currently enjoy. It takes Amazon's $38 billion a year arrangement where they charge for search result placement to put not the best product match that you have, but the one that's bid the most at the top of your search results. The first link on Amazon on average is 29% more expensive than the best match for a query. That top row is 25% more expensive. And you have to go 17 places down on average to get to the best match for your query. So what you're doing is you're immediately shifting money from platform owners to platform users. But the best part of this is it's a highly administratable remedy, right? If you want to figure out whether or not someone is violating this rule, all you have to do is send a message and see if it's delivered by the person on the other side. Do a search and see if the best result comes up. So rather than having these fact-intensive tribunals where you depose the engineers for Facebook to figure out whether or not they've done all they can to fight harassment or some other thing that we've decided we want them to do to behave better, we have these bright line tests that we can look at very easily and that third parties can examine very easily. You don't have to wait for a lawmaker to do it. And if we create private rights of action here, where people who are aggrieved can sue and extract exemplary damages from platforms who violate this rule, then what you create is a system that has multiple kinds of enforcers, public and private, where the enforcement burden is very low and where the penalties are very high, that strikes directly at the kind of power that platforms have to attack platform users, both business customers and end users. So that's my very wonky answer, but I think it's a good one. I think it's a very straightforward one.
Thank you very much for that, Corey. And as we have gone over time, I will hand the floor over to Yanis, if you can close us. Yanis.
Well, it's been a delight sharing this platform with Corey. Thank you, Meron. Thank you to everyone who has been watching. I'm afraid I've got some bad news for you, Corey. You know, Margrethe Vestager, whom you obviously appreciate, she's been fired.
I know.
And she's been fired at the behest of big tech. And the gentleman that has replaced her is also there at the behest of big tech in order not to continue, anything that annoys them. So anyway, let me make the point that just answer the question of, or actually giving an example of what we can do. As Corey said, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, the reason why we have an urgent need for democratic politics is that on the basis of voluntarism and individual action, nothing is going to change. No progressive move is going to be completed, even if it is attempted. This is not a question of scratching each other's backs and doing things to ameliorate our personal ego or the pain that we feel for living in a world that is grossly irrational and wastes so many opportunities that we have as humanity. This is why we need democratic politics, right? And an example of that, which in a way combines traditional forms of political action, of trade union activity with big tech, and a large and very necessary dose of transnationalism or internationalism, is the campaign of the Progressive International, #MakeAmazonPay. It's been running now for a few years. It is a pilot program. The idea of Make Amazon Pay was initially to try to create a rolling strike which is transnational and aims at one of these big tech companies, in this particular case, Amazon. It starts with the first light of day during Black Friday in warehouses in Vietnam, and then moves to Bangladesh, to India, to Germany, to New Jersey, and finishes off in Seattle. If we manage to combine these rolling strikes of Amazon workers with a campaign of solidarity, like, for instance, don't visit Amazon.com at all for one day, which is no skin off your nose, literally and metaphorically, and then use this as a pilot scheme for rolling strikes and combined strikes against big tech targets, in combination with particular demands on our lawmakers for changing the rules under which these companies can extract so much value without actually producing anything except the power by which to extract those rents from us. That, I think, is a good way of ending the night by providing an example of what can be done as opposed to hopelessness.
Thank you, Yanis, and thank you, Corey. Thanks to you guys out there. That was a lot of fun. I know we went over time, but I personally learned a lot, and judging from the very vibrant conversation in the chat, you guys did too. Everybody, please go to back Corey's new novel with the Kickstarter campaign. There's a link in the YouTube description and also in the chat. If anybody would like to support DiEM25, we have no big backers. Simply go to diem25.org/support. Don't forget to hit the bell icon on YouTube to stay abreast of any future videos that we put out. And we will see you at the same time